Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Dean. It's a great honor for me to give this lecture, especially with you here present, Ken. And thank you to everyone who's made it possible for me to be here, especially Michelle. Thanks to all of you for coming out to be here this evening. I hope I'm not going to bore you. Those were very long introductions, I have to say. In my culture, that's the length of the lecture. You know, Nelson Mandela used to say to me, why would you take 10 minutes to say what you can say in one? So I'm going to keep it pretty tight. What I want to do is tease out a few threads from recent projects of mine and try to weave a very short, small tapestry that I'm calling provisionally Ghosts and Bandits. One of these two projects that I'm particularly interested in taking further in my thinking is the one that Anne mentioned, the Mandela dialogues. So reckoning with oppressive pasts and the sense of responsibility before the ghosts of those who have died. You know, I thought I coined the term archive bandit, and I was put in my place by South American participants in that project, especially the Argentinians who tended to be the loudest. They said to me, no, we know this term, Los Bandidos de la Memoria. Yes, good compañeros, and I will quote them a couple of times. So the other project I'm wanting to weave into this tapestry is a collaboration with the South African cartoonist Zapiro. Any of you know his work, Zapiro? We think of him as the most famous cartoonist in the world. So I'm going to share a little bit of his work with you. I've done a number of projects over several years with him, but just in the last 6 months, did a seminar with him at the University of Cape Town, looking at his work in terms of spectrality, the ghosts in his cartoons. He's always getting into trouble with powerful people. He's often being sued for defamation. He even got into trouble with Nelson Mandela. I remember he shared this story with me. He first started drawing Mandela in the late 1980s, and I'll show you his first sketches. But it wasn't until around 1995 that he first did a really critical cartoon of Madela. And he tells the story of how he really struggled to do that cartoon, forced himself to do it. And then within 24 hours of its publication, he got a phone call from the presidency, and it was Nelson Mandela on the line to tell him what he thought of his cartoon. Zapiro, his real name is Jonathan Shapiro, was very apologetic and was trying to explain it. And Madela said, no, you don't have to explain it. I don't agree with you, but keep doing what you do. It's a very important role in society. Okay, so ghosts and bandits. My argument is provisional, and I'm hoping that all of you will disagree with at least something I say so that we can get some discussion going. Would you agree with me that the archive is fundamentally spectral? Have you ever had the sense of being haunted when you walk into an archive strong room with all these rows and boxes neatly labeled? Feels like a morgue, right? Full of remains of people and processes. And they're all out of place. They used to be in places of creation with people living and doing. And now they're in these rows like coffins. Have you ever felt going into the place of records creation? So it could be a residence, an author, Or it could be the office of an NGO, and you're engaging with the archive that's being generated in that space. Have you ever felt haunted by the many voices that are without names in those archives? Or the names without stories? Have you ever had the experience of reading something that you wrote a long time ago? So maybe a letter or an email, and thinking to yourself, who is this person? Because you've changed so much. You're encountering a ghost of yourself. What about reading a friend's Facebook page? And you are absorbing a representation of a happy, successful life, and you're thinking, but what about the pain, the broken relationships, the mess? Or you go into an exhibition and you're overwhelmed by the whispers of voices that are not represented. Any of you been into the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg? There's a dominant narrative, right? And there are voices that are heard over and over again, but many voices are not heard in spaces like that. So, for example, it's very little known is that by the end of the apartheid period, the great majority of police officials were black. What about their stories? It's too embarrassing. We don't represent that. I haven't been myself, the memorial at Ground Zero, but I'm told that it's almost impossible to hear the voices of the ones who flew those planes into the buildings. So the ghosts. What about public discourse? For me, this is a form of archive. Listening to the discourse around the next presidential election, I've been overwhelmed by the sense of the voices that are not being heard in this debate and the issues that are not being named at all. So listening today to Donald Trump talking about how he would have prevented 9/11 if he had been president, I hear the ghosts. Or what about encountering a cryptic trace in an archive? Something that you just can't make sense of. Derrida talks about one in his book Spurs. It's a little piece of paper in the Nietzsche archive, and it has the words, "I have forgotten my umbrella," on it. What does that mean? What do we do with something like that? The meaning and significance is spectral. An example from the Mandela archive, he used to have desk calendars when he was in prison. From 1976 through to his release, he always had this identical desk calendar. He would write notes. Came across a note for July of 1989, which read, "Met with very important person, did not discuss politics." Spectral. Took me 3 years to find out that that was President Botha. But always there's a ghosting around that kind of fragment, because you dig more and then you find out that, well, according to the then head of national intelligence, they did talk politics. And at the moment we're engaging with this individual who claims that he has worked off transcripts of conversations. They recorded every conversation Nelson Mandela had in the last 10 years of his imprisonment. But how to get our hands on those fragments? Well, we're going to have to engage in some banditry. I'm trying to make the point that the archive is always full of ghosts, fundamentally spectral. But then daily life is spectral, isn't it? We hear always the voices, faint as they might be, of those ghosted by power. And we can talk of the big structures of power, states, institutions, corporations, but we also need to talk about ourselves, the power that we wield. and the voices that we ghost. So the former selves, the ones that embarrass us, fill us with shame. They haunt us. And the question for me is, what is our responsibility before the ghosts? I'll come back to that question right at the end. I want to turn now to the work of Zapiro. And I've just got a few examples of what for me is a very rich corpus, which is full of ghosts. And I read Zapiro as feeling a fundamental responsibility to them. So I'm going to hope this works now. Yeah. So these are his first drawings of Mandela, 1988. Zapiro had been detained and was in Pollsmoor prison, the same prison that Mandela was in at that time. And it was almost Mandela's birthday, and the other prisoners persuaded Zapiro to draw a birthday card for Madiba. And these were his preliminary sketches for that birthday card. We don't know what happened to the card. It was probably taken by a warder and either thrown away or put in a file. That's the first image of Mandela that Zapiro drew after his release from prison. So that first set of sketches, Zapiro is working from historical images. Nobody knew what Madiba actually looked like until he walked out of prison, because, apart from the people who were visiting him, because it was illegal to publish photographs of him. So Zapiro was working off those old images. Here he's working off, he was in New York at this moment, and so he had seen photographs, seen footage of Madiba after his release from prison. This was meant to be a poster, but it was never used. That image, that drawing of Madiba, for me, is ghosted to some extent by the earlier images, the ones that were drawing on archival sources. I'm throwing this in because there's a beautiful anecdote of banditry connected to this. This puppet was made by Zapiro, and that's in 1999. So Mandela's just given his last speech as president of the country, and Zapiro shows him this puppet. The puppet disappeared shortly after this event. And when I was doing an exhibition with Zapiro a few years ago, he kept on saying, but if only we had that puppet, we could use it in the exhibition. And while we were doing the research, we saw on a website a photograph of this puppet. And thought, well, maybe this company, which does props for plays and movies and so on, maybe they've got the puppets. So we set up an appointment. We told a few lies about what we were there to do. We got inside. We got to see the actual puppet, and that's the moment we revealed why we were really there, and managed to get it out and back into Zapiro's domain. So we were bandits for a good cause. So this is an image of gay and lesbian activists in Zimbabwe. President Mugabe at that time, and he's continued to do it ever since, making homophobic statements and threatening this community. Those are ghosted voices for me. Naming them would be dangerous. That for me is an example of a ghost of self. So that's President Zuma, through the shadow being reminded of this part of who he is, who ultimately he will have to confront. We hope it will be formally in courts. This character is called Craig Williamson. He was a military intelligence operative. He was involved in the murders of a number of activists. And here he is giving evidence at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and trying to blame others, people who were already dead. And so they were represented as ghosts. So this is, for me, an example of a difficult ghosted voice. This is Eugene de Kock. One of the harsh realities about post-apartheid South Africa is that very few perpetrators of human rights violations have actually been held accountable. And just a handful were sent to prison. He's one of them. He applied for amnesty from the Truth Commission. He was given amnesty for many of his acts, but some of them he didn't get amnesty for. He's just been released from prison on parole, just in the last few months. But this cartoon is representing the extent to which he was a foot soldier. He claims he was given orders, and these are the powerful politicians and senior bureaucrats who are giving him the orders, who have never had to pay for what they did. So it's a kind of spectral presence. He's not dead. He's a living person. Zapiro uses the dream sequence frequently. So he has a dream, ghosts of the past, the present, and the future. That's former President Mbeki, and the issue being represented there is his problematic, some would say irrational policy on HIV/AIDS. So there's the Apartheid Museum being represented. The character in the showcase on the right-hand side is a former apartheid-era spy who became the leader of the National Party after de Klerk, but ultimately became a cabinet minister and a member of the African National Congress. And so Zapiro is using this spectral device to remind him that one day he might be represented in the Apartheid Museum in a way that he would find difficult, embarrassing. That for me is what I would call a spectral happening. So that's the wheels coming off again. It's President Zuma, but the wheels turn out to be tapes. They're the spy tapes, which recur over and over again in public discourse, and which are significant to the attempt to hold him accountable for some of the things he's done. This is what I would call a déjà vu tableau. So you have an apartheid-era image, that's Verwoerd, using laws to close down human rights. And now we have a post-apartheid president who's using laws to squeeze out the reach of democracy. Okay, so for me, Zapiro's signature as an artist is spectral, and his corpus is an expression or a representation of hauntology. Now, I'm not suggesting that he's unique. I'm not an expert on cartoons, but I imagine that there are many cartoons who use this kind of device, and I think I'm naming a genre rather than a particular practitioner. But I'd go further and argue that Zapiro exemplifies what I call archive banditry. Now, before trying to define what I mean by archive banditry, let me share a personal anecdote. A key moment for me in my professional career, this was the first time I started thinking of myself as an archival bandit. 1998, so the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established in 1995. Its final report was delivered to Nelson Mandela in 1998. I was head of coordination between the Truth Commission and the National Archives. As the TRC was being closed down and the archives were being gathered and prepared for transfer to the National Archives, I was told by one of the functionaries that 34 boxes of files had been removed by the National Intelligence Agency. And over a period of about a year, I tried using official channels to locate these boxes, find out why they'd been removed. I'd been told that they contained certain really significant investigations, assassinations, and so on. And some of the families involved had been told that these investigations were very sensitive and that they couldn't get access to the files. Now, I was told after a year of digging around by superiors that you need to keep quiet about this. There's nothing we can do. In time, they will be transferred to the National Archives. Well, late in 2000, at a conference, I talked about this publicly. I was then charged with misconduct because I had disclosed classified information. That's when I decided to leave the National Archives and with some colleagues set up a small Freedom of Information NGO. And we started using access to information legislation to try to get out precisely the kind of records that were contained in these 34 boxes. In terms of banditry, before leaving the National Archives, what I did was to photocopy the list of files in those 34 boxes. And I put it on a routine inquiries file. And then I waited a year. And after a year, put in a Promotion of Access to Information Act request for access to the routine inquiries file. And I was then given access to the routine inquiries file, which meant I could then put the list of files into the public domain. And that became the basis for litigation. Ultimately, there's a good ending to this particular story, is that in 2005, those boxes were given to the National Archives, and our organization, SAHA, was able to get about 65% of the contents into the public domain. So, archive banditry. Zapiro, my own story. For me, archive bandits shape their endeavor in a relation of hospitality to the voices which press in from outside the systems and structures they find themselves in, and at the same time to the voices deep inside themselves. Far from being lawless, as most dictionary definitions of banditry suggest, archive bandits honor justice as a lawful practice which trumps the laws that polities pass to protect their interests. They respect the archival trace rather than the biggest and the strongest tracers. They will not be bought or simply go away. They are haunted. Now, not all of us are called to be full-time bandits. Not all of us are called to be crusaders, if you like, Zapiros, setting up freedom of information NGOs, working in truth and reconciliation commissions, and so on. But I would argue that all of us who call ourselves archivists, all of us who work with archive, are called by banditry. For the ghosts demand our attention. At the most basic level, and I'm trying to think of an average workplace, archival workplace, could be here at the university. You're tasked with the arrangement and description of some accumulation of records. You're stretched by the demands of daily professional life, many duties. You have to learn to listen to the voices of the specters which mirage that accumulation of records. The specters of authors, of content that is not there, of contexts which are not known or are unknowable, places of origin, stories without names, names without stories. We have to learn to listen to the ghosts of our own positioning within profession, within institution, in terms of the bigger histories of organization and of country, I would argue. And here let me start, and I won't quote Derrida more than twice. Quoting him, in 1994 he published a book, Spectres of Marx, which he dedicated to Chris Hani, who had been assassinated in South Africa the previous year. And in this book he says, quote, "No justice seems possible or thinkable without the principle of some responsibility before the ghosts of those who are not yet born or who are already dead," unquote. Now I think he missed here the ghosts of the living, the ones who are damaged, the ones who are haunted by themselves before they were violated. We have a responsibility before them. And I think he also missed the responsibility we all carry before the ghosts of self, those difficult parts of who we are, which I mentioned earlier. Now, if Derrida is right when he says that justice is the relation to the other, our relation to the other, then justice in principle begins with attention to and responsibility before the others inside. So I'm arguing that all of us need to pay attention to the ghosts. All of us will feel the need to engage in banditry. Listening to the ghosts is not easy. It requires courage and imagination. It demands the closest reading of archive, with the grain and against the grain. And it is most often resisted by structures and systems of power. And that could be a university archive. It's resisted because attending to the ghosts is readily seen by these structures and systems to be subversive. Arguably, it is subversive. It questions everything. It tends to disturb dominant narratives. It diverts energy, time, and resources from what is most often seen to be core business. It allows what is regarded as the personal into the professional. It can be very messy. It tempts one to prioritize personal agendas over institutional mandates. And it has to engage with the reality that not all ghosts are, and I'm putting the word in inverted commas, good. There are bad spirits and demons, ghosted voices that we actually want to stay ghosted. Each one of us has an inventory, I'm sure, of the voices that we would prefer to remain ghosted. In my case, let me confess the ghosts that I'm not really interested in attending to. White supremacists, ancestors of mine who were settlers, who colonized South Africa, apartheid-era security operatives, the Craig Williamsons of this world, the Eugene de Koks of this world. My teenage self, a ghost, fundamentalist Christian I still haven't reckoned with. I could go on. What about the pedophiles, the rapists, the serial killers? What do we do with them in the world of archive? So I'm not romanticizing attending to the ghosts and the call to banditry. Which ghosts do I pay attention to? Which do I prioritize? So it's dangerous space. But it's a space in which I'm arguing banditry is unavoidable. I'm coming to a conclusion now. For some, for instance, the Dutch scholar Esther Perrin, the ghost is a metaphor. So ghosts are those ones who have been ghosted by power. They've been silenced or they've been marginalized. They haunt structures of power and those who benefit from such structures. And the imperative is to seek ways of empowering them. Anybody here know Esther Perrin's work? No? In contrast, for Derrida, the spectral is a figuring which configures all figures. It is a logic exceeding all binary opposites, but particularly the opposites self, other, presence, absence, visible, invisible, life, death, being, non-being, and real, unreal. In Derrida, it is ontology inflected, stretched by epistemology, even theology, to become what he calls hauntology. So for Derrida, to live is to be haunted. The ghosts are real. In my country, there are long cultures and traditions of listening to the ancestors. In a Derridian frame, this would not be a metaphor. It would not be a way of accessing ancient wisdom. It could actually be listening to the voices of ancestors. Derrida is haunted by a justice which is always coming, by a democracy which equally is always coming, by a hospitality which is impossible but demands reaching for, by a similarly impossible forgiveness, and so on and on. And this haunting is a call to action. For Derrida, as for Avery Gordon, haunting is distinctive for producing a something to be done. But what is that something? What action are we called to beyond, that is, listening to the ghosts in a relation of responsibility? No one can prescribe what we must do with our listening or demand particular forms of banditry. In deconstruction, only listening is prescriptive. And arguably, that is the act of banditry, especially when you're listening to the ghosts that make you uncomfortable, the voices that you don't actually want to listen to. I have no blueprint. I have no set of easy principles I can share with you. I'm reminded of what a 14-year-old once wrote on my kitchen wall, and I'm going to close with this. It's still on the kitchen wall. We work in the dark. We do what we can. We give what we have. Thank you.